This is Audible.
The Calculus of Battle by David Geimer. Performed by John Banks, Cliff Chapman, Steve Conlin, Toby Longworth, and Luis Soto. The planetary body on the other side of the fizzing coherence field was little more than a shadow to him. Two-dimensional, the albedo of orbiting warships conveying a glitter pattern of coded data. It was the numbers that transformed the planet into a world. Varicine, garrison world, population 7.45 billion. The data was inloaded to Cardan Stronos' display as fast as he could read it, golden text strolling across the inner curve of his visor. A jet of frigid vapor blasted over him as he marched under the turbofans of a Thunderhawk gunship in pre-flight and onto the embarkation deck, his honor guard close behind.
The planet is 73% overrun.
The voice of the Magos Calculi scratched at Stronos' speech centers where the flesh interfaced with the data tether.
The Navy has the alien abhorrence fleet contained for the short to medium term, but ground forces continue to spread at an exponential rate. X-loading graphics now.
The parabola splayed across Stronos' display, temporarily displacing the relentless inload of screed to the periphery.
Armed resistance at 0.9%, roughly. The calculus prognoses certain and imminent annihilation of all Imperial presence.
I don't disagree, Magos.
Stronos' own voice, deepened and deadened by the immobility of a metallic throat and mouth, legacy of an old wound, was at least recognizable as something that once was, and still aspired to be, human.
Withdrawal is indicated. The Leviathan threatens many worlds, 18 in this subsector alone.
It is them that I am thinking of. 0.9% of 2 billion fighting men would make a material contribution to any war zone.
Questionable. You overlook your own losses, expenditure of materiel to refuel, rearm, and repair.
And how many men is one Space Marine worth in this war?
Do you wish for an answer, War Leader? I have one.
Stiff-muscled, particularly around the mouth, Stronos frowned behind his visor. On derricks and hanging pallets all over the flight deck, dozens of blank-faced servitors tested every bolt and rivet of every black and silver gunship for signs of stress or damage. The uniformed ratings necessary to supervise their labors saluted as Stronos and his retinue marched by the hallowed machines.
The battle calculus can be flexible.
1 + 1 always equals 2.
And if we add one again? You talk of a closed system, Magos, but I fully intend to open it up.
There was a moment's inactivity from the data tether.
Your armor's spirit informs me that you are on the embarkation deck. I take it your mind is set.
Take it as you see it, my friend.
The code presence in his organic cortex sighed.
Cost increases in line with potential gains. The ratio remains marginal.
I will work that margin.
Dispensing with any superfluous sign-off, the Magos Calculi disconnected.
What is the prognosis?
Though he was half a stride behind, Sergeant Jallinghal clearly knew who he had been communing with. They were Iron Hands. Their bond of brotherhood went deeper than mere blood and flesh. Their battle plate and bionics linked by a stream of inload-exload, unbroken in almost 600 years.
Immediate insertion. We will reinforce the cordon around the Varsis Citadel and buy time for the evacuation.
This world has proven its weakness. It is a blight that should be excised.
So it was. Even brothers did not always see eye to eye.
Dead men do not learn from their errors, Sergeant.
A canker that is burned from the body will not metastasize, spreading fear and weakness to distant worlds. And for what? A few million men? Do you know how many billions are deployed to this sector alone?
Stronos looked to their Thunderhawk, bearing the silvered heraldry of the Iron Council. Deck servitors, their hands welded to massive winch handles, operated the turntable that slowly cranked the gunship's armored nose around to face the intemperate blue glare of the coherence field. Its powering turbofans filled Stronos' body with the visceral, full-body thunder of raw machine aggression. The energy field spasmed under the inky caress of the Thunderhawk's exhaust fumes. He strode towards the open assault ramp.
There are 18 million men down there, brother. A drop in the ocean, maybe. But it is my drop. My ocean.
Jallankhal dipped his cable-snarled helm in acquiescence and followed Stronos wordlessly into the gunship. The veteran iron hands of his honor guard began to lock themselves into position for launch, but Stronos stopped them.
No. No restraints, brothers.
It is protocol.
We fight not only the alien, but our own calculus. The cost of every second is measured in lives.
Stronos switched his Vox frequency to interface with the servitor pilot in the cockpit.
Ready for launch!
Jallankhal and his clave readied their weapons as the assault ramp closed on its hydraulics, and the turbofans built towards liftoff. The descent from high polar geostationary orbit to the combat zone was rapid. The clave had their weapons loaded, blessed, and triply checked. Stronos' Stormbolter communicated with his armor's core intelligence in a series of clicks and pings as it ran self-diagnostics. His relic weapon, the ancient axe of Medusa, chattered nonsense to itself as it stole tactical inloads from Stronos' armor. The servo skull wired between its cock-tooth axe blades, always hungry for raw data. The migrainous pinch of the Magos calculi interrupted his thoughts.
8%.
Even Stronos' advanced war gear was struggling to punch a Vox signal through the psychoelectric field distortions of the hive mind. But the words from the neural tether were clear.
That is the potential benefit-to-loss ratio of your current action. 8%.
Stronos ignored him. His attention was split between the tactical charts in his visor display and its accompanying screed.
Bring us down. Grid Zeta 3. It is easy terrain, and the line there is crumbling. If it falls, the Tyranids will be on the walls in minutes. Order all inbound Thunderhawks to deploy to adjacent grids, a half ring from Epsilon 18 to the range of hills encroaching from Zeta 1. Then to provide additional air cover to the evacuation craft.
Jallankhal nodded in approval.
A wall of iron, but it will not endure indefinitely against such numbers.
The flesh is weak, brother.
Some weaker than others.
Stronos clasped his brother's pauldron, a pre-battle ritual that Jallankhal had never yet decided to acknowledge. No one walked into punishment like an Iron Hand. The assault ramp lowered, even as the Thunderhawk leveled out, the ramp wobbling in a ferocious wind. It was a dry world. The briefing inloads had told him that, but seeing it for himself was different. It was windswept, coppery and dark. The tactical charts that flickered across his display to keep pace with the gunship described a prehistoric ocean basin. The gross contours Stronos could still see, but everything less had been flooded beneath a seething tide of alien filth. Chitinous bodies rushed like seawater over rocks, and, even over the engine thunder of the gunship's fans, Stronos could hear the clacking of segmented legs and hideously irrational body plans. The great devourer swept beneath him towards the static guns of the Imperial Guard. Stronos had no stomach, but he still felt sickened by it. Jallankhal raised a fist.
Praise the Omnissiah for the Leviathan. We demonstrate the weakness of flesh today.
Stronos nodded.
Let us unbalance the calculus.
Then he stepped off the ramp. He smashed into the tide like a colossal bomb, dropped by an overflying marauder. Bone shards and alien blood spraying high into the air. The tremendous mass of his augmented Terminator plate and servo harness drove him into the ground, when a lesser body would have been bowled through the swarm after the gunship. He rose from his knees with a cry of actuators, Tyranid warrior forms by the thousand already thundering towards him with a single, irresistible will. His storm bolter gave a blur as it ranked targets from 1 all the way to 999 and established a fire pattern. He fired. Alien bodies burst as he sprayed the scrabbling beast with bolter shells. A termagant with 2 thick rows of spines running along its back managed to scramble between exploding bodies and pounce. Stronos beheaded it with a single swipe of his axe. The weapon's servo mind muttered as it consumed the feast of kill data, reluctantly passing scraps to Stronos' display. The screed had not paused for a moment, but had been shunted to the side again to allow his tactically augmented reality to become the main focus. Brightly defined blocks scrolled down the edges of his display, appraising him of the Xenos creature's bone density, muscle distribution, death reflexes, and the exact amount of force necessary to kill it. That amount of force was exactly what Stronos hammered into the neck of the next beast that tried to gallop past him. Another scrabbled in behind, bounded onto the first alien's corpse, then sprung off just as Stronos swung for it. The quick shift in direction fooled his combat algorithms and spared its neck at the expense of its groin. It appeared to feel no pain as the axe of Medusa hacked it open, but slithered to the ground in a welter of gore, its legs suddenly unable to bear its weight. Stronos stamped on it, the force of his heavily reinforced armor driven down through his heel.
4%.
The Magos Calculi's reasoned modulation amidst the alien stampede was jarring.
It drops so quickly.
You have unbalanced the equation, as I believe was your intention. Every second removes more Imperial resource from the world. By your actions, and the actions of your gunship pilots, are the benefits of such action diminished.
The hiss-click of his storm bolter's autoloaders seamlessly interjected into the hard roar of gunfire. He shattered the skull of a Hormagort, refusing to retreat a single stride, and then drew a tasteless breath of his armor's purified air. It was the first he had needed since embarkation. His machine lungs were commendably efficient.
But I do miss the taste of alien blood on my lips.
He was tracking the active runes of his clave with his organic eye. Clad in power armor, their lesser mass had necessitated a more conventional deployment. But the clave advanced now. War machines in approximated human form, stark and black, gunmetal grills and gorget bundles underlit by the blaze of semi-automatic fire. Automatic status updates blinked between their armor systems and their war leaders as they drew close, but not a word was wasted in greeting. Stronos expected none. He looked back, his first real-world glimpse of the beleaguered Varsis citadel. He grunted hollowly. It had seemed more formidable in schematic. A ragged cheer rang out as an armored fist squadron, 4 beat-up chimeras, escorted by a Lehman Russ, with guardsmen clinging to cargo netting on the vehicle's hulls, trundled towards the Iron Hands. The escorting battle tank clattered on one creaking track, dropping slowly off the pace, belching off black smoke each time its frustrated driver tried to up gear and make up the distance on the transports. Jallinghal shredded a pair of Tyranid warrior forms with bursts of bolter fire.
Unexpected reinforcements!
For the second time in one day, Stronos' facial muscles tried to force an expression where there could be none. Centuries he had lived as one of the Iron Hands, and still, mortals could surprise him.
They come to our aid.
What manner of angels do they choose to see in us, I wonder?
Ratio now at 2% within the margin of error.
We are the sources of that error, Magos. I will make the margin what I wish it to be.
Stronos disconnected from the link, then issued his armor a mental command to isolate the platoon commander's frequency and open a channel.
Return to the defensive line. We cannot hold them here. Turn back!
The response was a hash of static. The platoon's systems lacked the power of a standard Adeptus Astartes squad's war gear, much less that of an Iron Hand's command clave. Stronos modulated his own signal power to compensate.
This is Lieutenant Zero, requesting throw for you. Order.
Stronos held the signal power there.
Reverse, Lieutenant. Your priority is the evacuation. Turn back now.
Panicked noises punctuated the static. Stronos saw the Lehman Russ's long turret cannon begin to traverse. Levitating above the smaller bioforms, like a fetal deformity displayed on an invisible cushion, was an atrophied creature with a cranium so vast that it appeared to have withered its own limbs in order to feed its growth. Its eyes began to glow until torrid incandescence seeped through the gaps in its exoskeleton. There was a pulse, just as Stronos' optics began to burr in protest of the witchlight, and a bolt of energy jabbed from the alien's cranial ridge towards the row of vehicles. A synapse blinked later, and an implosive crack peeled out from one of the chimeras. The tank managed to rumble a few meters on, then flipped into the air with a bubble of green-veined lightning, opening its hull from the inside, shedding screaming guardsmen as it somersaulted once and crashed to the ground on its roof. Then, the tank's battle cannon fired. The Lehman Russ rocked back and the creature vanished in a maelstrom of vindictive counter-annihilation worthy of an ally of the Iron Hands. Smoke rose from the tank's motive units. The big gun's recoil had finally done for the damaged track, and the Lehman Russ ground to a terminal halt. A swarm of smaller Tyranids scuttled in through the wreckage, smoke and debris. Multi-lasers and sponson-mounted heavy bolters mowed down their numbers, but they were too many and too fast. Stronos bellowed at the swarmed tanks.
Reverse!
Fire! Fire! All guns now! Fire!
Stronos steeled himself as lasfire stitched out from the vehicles. Numbered brackets enclosed targets of choice. The axe of Medusa excitedly shunted reserve power to its blades.
Clave Stronos, new objective. Exterminate.
Jallinghal swung his bolter from the main swell of the tide.
Confirmed! Exterminate!
His words were cut short by a Tyranid blade lift. The gigantic warrior form was twice the height of a space marine, upright, encased in thick bone armor that soaked up the Clave's snapshot fire as it hacked through ceramite and iron to cleave off Jallinghal's arm at the elbow. The second of 4 switching blades reversed back, then rammed up to skewer the veteran Iron Hand through the belly, serrated bone erupting between his shoulders in a welter of sparks. Damage signifiers turned a portion of Stronos' visor display red.
Brother!
Calmly, Jallinghal lifted his bolter one-handed and blasted the monster's face apart. Only once he was mathematically convinced of its death did he then shoot through the arm attached to the impaling blade and drop, the bone sword still embedded in him.
Brother, are you combat effective?
The sergeant responded with a hail of fire into the swarm.
A flesh wound. If a Tyranid intends to fell an Iron Hand of my age, then it will need to be more thorough.
Stronos turned his fire on the warrior forms assailing his brothers. The guardsmen were on their own. He felt the shockwave as the Lehman Russ's shell store detonated, blowing off the tank's turret. The remaining chimeras belatedly backed up, slowly, finding it tough going through the swarm of gaunts that had already got between them and the defense lines. Stronos moved ponderously through the melee of hammering bolters and hissing claws. A large Tyranid warrior struggling in the grip of his servo arm. Bioacid and bone missiles scratched the gilt from his armor. But he knew, as Jallinghal had known, that he could take the punishment. Therein lay the key power of the calculus. To ensure that victory was certain before ever setting foot on a world. Hearing the scream of descending turbofans, he looked up into the white glare of spotlights and a brutal downwash that tossed dust across his faceplate. The gunship came down, pre-emptying the data mission that he had known was coming.
Ratio at 0, War Leader. There is nothing further to be gained.
I know.
The gunship's underwing heavy bolters murdered the ground beneath it, enough to lower its ramp. Jallinghal and the Honor-Clave stomped towards it, their own bolters overlapping meticulously to keep the swarm from the aircraft. Last to go, Stronos turned to watch as a pack of Hormagaunts leapt into the back of one of the chimeras. Screams tore across the box, one longer and more immediate in its agony than the others. The tank had evidently been Jaro's. The last spits of lasfire sputtered out, heavier bioforms with massive rending tusks chewing through the stranded vehicles. Stronos kept his compassion for humanity alive by keeping it cold, locked forever in iron like an undying corpse in the body of a dreadnought. And he turned his gaze to the ocean of purple and white carapace that seethed towards the faltering siege guns of the citadel. It had been a long time since Cardan Stronos had been truly afraid, but he thought he could imagine the terror that would soon grip the people of Varsis. His helm pictures recorded the scene. It would almost certainly be useful data to somebody, one day.
Terminate the evacuation. Recall all chapter vessels.
He could hear the desperate pleas of the tank crew, through the metal of the last Chimera's armor, and through the vox bead of Lieutenant Jarrow, whose lifeless ear must have been pressed against it. He ignored them. Ultimately, they were all merely numbers in an equation.
The Embrace of Pain by Ian St. Martin. Performed by John Banks, Antonia Beamish, Robin Bauman, Steve Conlin, and Louis Soto. In the nightmare realm of the Eye of Terror, reality mingles with the warp beyond. It is purgatory, dwelling place of the outcast and the damned. Yet even those twisted souls who call it home could never claim safety from its fractious storms. Planet-sized gales of howling faces blink into twisted life before melting back into the ever-shifting tides. Shadows gather beneath the tortured depths of raw emotion, schools of beings that know neither death nor life, parting for the passage of great leviathans that blot the stars themselves. Ruin swims through everything, and all it requires to take root is a moment, the slightest flaw in even the most resolute of defenses. The diadem carves through such gruesome currents, its hull of bleached purple and pearlescent silver shining within the protection of its Geller field. The halo of golden light flares as the ether assails it, repelling the swarms of Neverborn, hungering for the souls beneath the ancient warship's iron skin. Waves of demonkind crash against the vessel, leaving a comet's trail behind it as they immolate and dissolve back into the base matter of the Sea of Souls. From across its crenellated hull, 1,296 statues stand in silent repose. The lithe musculatures and savage claws of their inert forms shine in the infernal light with myriad lusters. Eyes of platinum, flawless marble and smoked glass stare unblinking. A frozen army of repulsive seduction focused on the warship's bridge. They watch in silence, their gaze never wavering, as a shadow falls over the diadem. They watch in silence as a new storm appears. A sprawling morass of vile corruption blooms like a diseased aurora, extending cancerous tendrils over the diadem's hull. A deluge of mucus and blood-laced pus smashes down, drowning the warship in poison even as it burns at the Gellerfield's touch. Deep within the diadem, ancient machines choke and spark. Placating entreaties chitter from the cowls of the robed heretics surrounding them, struggling to maintain the Gellerfield against this immaterial assault. The bones of the warship shudder in a chorus of protesting steel as its engines labor to break free of the caustic quagmire. The corridors and passageways of the diadem, their walls vibrating with deafeningly discordant rhythms, in concert with the blinding, kaleidoscopic glare, are suddenly plunged into complete, silent darkness. Serfs in heavy suits of insulated rubber scurry through the passages, alarmed by the sound of their own panicked hearts. The things that live in the shadows rejoice, shrieking with delight as their hunting grounds swell. Where other vessels of grim quiet and wan light would explode with the cries of klaxons, their corridors drowning in crimson emergency lighting, aboard the Diadem, gloom and quiet accomplish the same jarring alarm. Something has slipped through the Gellerfield. Something is now on board. It begins as a single spore, barely beyond a microbe in scale when it manifests. The frigid air of the Diadem's main embarkation deck shivers around it as it divides and multiplies. Within moments, it is the size of a clutch of eggs, a fetid, brackish mass of quivering virulence. Dark, indistinct shapes wriggle within its sweating membrane. The deck crew scatters in fright as it swells beyond the size of a man, its glistening translucent flesh straining and splitting. The tumorous knot of corruption heaves, exploding outward in a welter of pus and rotten gore. Men and women scream as it soaks them, flesh sloughing from their bones. Caustic acids dissolve the organic and mechanical in equal measure, pitting the walls and deck plating. It eats through refueling stations and arming racks, detonating ordnance stores and fuel bladders that fill the embarkation deck with fire and thick, oily smoke. A trembling cloud of pitch black unfurls from the carnage as thousands of glistening plague flies take wing into reality. They sweep over the deck, a tide of rust and corrosion spreading in their wake. With nothing but husks remaining to feast upon, the flies converge into a directed mass and smash against a reinforced bulkhead hatch. The doorway warps and sizzles as their venom eats through plasteel and iron. The bulkhead fails, its surface drooling to the deck as if struck by a melter blast, and the flies surge into the ship's veins. In the piercing glare of stab lights, the cohort's Nazakai prepare for war in their arming chamber. Blades shriek against whetstones. Those warriors not permanently bonded with their armor now stand on low plinths as slaves machine their warplate into place. Fallen angels imbibe combat stimulants and etheric alchemical cocktails to drive the numbness from their bleached synapses before the fighting begins. The Nazakai bladesmen stand in loose ranks around a raised platform where one warrior stands alone. Eyes, once the stark green of humanity's ancestral forests, now threaded with blackened blood vessels, set into a raw mask of ritual scars, look down upon his warband. The warband of Lucius the Eternal. Lucius is the first to hear it, the building drone beyond the gooseflesh thrum of power armor, a noise born not of machine, but of pestilence. Flies explode into the arming chamber, through vents, gaps in bulkheads, and up from the mesh of the deck plating. The swarm twists and congregates into a sickening pall, ignoring the snarling legionaries and coming to roil before their leader. Slick with mucus, the vile insects mash together, flowing like inky quicksilver to form a revolting simulacrum of a human face. It utters a single word, spoken with the voice of the grave. Come. The face melts back into the cloud, which shudders as the flies twitch and die. 1,000 tiny bodies falling onto the platform before Lucius. He stares at them for a moment, a sneer twisting his features.
Clarion?
Lucius knows she is listening. When the telepathic reply comes, it arrives with the angelic, lyrical voice of a child, wrapped around words and a tone belonging to a being more ancient than mankind.
Master.
You are unharmed?
I am. The incursion is confined to the embarkation deck for now. I can feel the crew. The rot takes root within them. This presence will spread unless it can be excised quickly.
Lucius looks to his warriors. From over 1,000 that marched with him at its height, the cohorts Nasikai now number barely above 50. Those remaining are conceited and debauched killers, sword fighters whose highest priorities are their own conquests, and the slaves reaved to fuel their deteriorating capacity for depraved sensation. They eye Lucius hungrily, straining at the leash for the command to purge the diadem of the invading plague.
Vespertillo?
Lucius looks up into the leering mask of the raptor chieftain, hanging inverted by his talons from the ceiling of the chamber with his brethren.
Take the Rypax and secure the Enginarium. Kill anything that attempts to disrupt our Geller field.
Vespertillo hisses an affirmation from abused vocal cords, rendered shrill and waspish from the drill of his fanged warhelm. The raptor's cloak, strips of flayed skin fashioned to resemble feathers, rustles as he swings down and claws away from the chamber with his kindred, their talons rending the deck beneath them. Lucius looks to his remaining warriors.
Cesare, Agenian, go with 10 and safeguard the navigator's sanctum. Chrysitheus, take the rest and see to the bridge. I shall deal with the intrusion myself.
Lucius watches resentment and frustration stiffen their postures. It has been weeks since any have experienced combat beyond the dueling cages. Since Lucius's moratorium on killing within what was left of the warband, their yearning to spill blood threatens to boil over into frenzy. Gauntlets clench around sheathed blades, garishly painted faces twist in anger, and low snarls hiss from elaborate visors, carved to resemble lions and screaming eagles. Preening glory hounds, nearly all of them desire to see Lucius dead. The mutual knowledge that they are powerless to perform this deed splits the Eternal's lips in a cruel grin. None could best Lucius with a blade, and even if the unthinkable were to happen, it would not be long before the victor, unable to resist basking in the glory of their achievement, became nothing more than another wailing face upon his armor. Chrysitheus in particular shows an aggressively hostile posture. Lucius can feel the ambition emanating from his lieutenant, the hunger to draw his blade and take the warband he so desperately desires to lead.
Eternal One, you must not... Must?
Lucius's sword is at Chrysitheus's throat faster than even transhuman eyes can track. The weapon is legendary, its blade radiant silver, bestowed upon Lucius by the Phoenician himself. Before he abandoned his children, he had taught the galaxy that even Primarchs could die. Lucius tilts his head.
Do tell me, what must I do? Was that the beginning of an order, Chrysitheus?
Blood trickles from the tip of the blade into the lieutenant's gorget, and Lucius's smile widens.
Dearest brother, it seems you have mistaken me for yourself.
Cesare lays an ivory gauntlet upon Chrysitheus's pauldron, the sullen apothecary's tone calm and measured.
Brother,
Lucius is disappointed to see Chrysitheus, after lingering for a moment, turn away, salving his ego by barking orders to the other warriors making for the bridge. Lucius watches them go, allowing himself a moment to savor the amusing bitterness radiating from his warband. Fleeting pleasure notwithstanding, such displays serve another of Lucius's purposes. Chrysitheus and the rest of the cohors Nazakai had shown Lucius that despite all they have lost of themselves in thrall to the youngest god, they still feel enough to hate him. Their frayed synapses, degenerated by excess and atrocity within the Eye of Terror, can still manage that. Sheathing his sword and stepping down from the platform, dead flies pop and crush beneath Lucius's boots as he departs, turning down the corridor towards the embarkation deck. If there is any fell creature of the warp that Lucius loathes most, it is the servants of the Plague God. Things with broken faces and bodies covered in dislocated vestigial limbs lunge and stagger towards him, leaving slicks of pus and straw-colored fluid upon the deck in their wake. The demons have superiority in numbers, but their lumbering, arrhythmic assault has failed to even come close to landing a blow against him. He hasn't even troubled to draw his blade. As he sways and dances aside from clubbing limbs and weeping claws, Lucius scans the flaming wreck that the embarkation deck has become. This rabble could not have pierced the Gellerfield alone. Something is anchoring them here. The one who sent Lucius the challenge in the arming chamber. Lucius hears it then, through the moans of demons and the droning beat of locust wings, the voice of the grave calling to him once more.
Rejoice!
The smoke and insects part to show a hunched figure in baroque, corroded armor.
The era of pox and contagion is upon you.
The figure approaches, its gait slow and labored, leaning upon a war scythe, longer than it is tall. Lucius sees the crumbling iconography of the 14th Legion between the rivulets of drool and clusters of wriggling buboes. Death Guard. The demons part around their champion, shrinking back in deference. Lucius sneers, his hand upon the pommel of his sword now.
I'm afraid not. Your revolting rabble has turned my ship into a flaming bucket of filth. It'll take weeks to rid it of your stench.
The Plague Champion makes a breathless, heaving noise as it gives voice to strangled laughter, though its chest does not move. A lipless mouth gapes behind its incomplete visor.
This truth can never be expunged once it has taken root.
The sword is in Lucius's grip now, and his barbed, demonic lash spools into his right hand. Venom drools from its barbs. His grin is a cage of needles.
You are Death Guard, eh? It has been long since I've last seen your kind. Have I had the pleasure?
There was a time when perhaps this body marched beside you to erect the dominion of the throne of lies. But that is irrelevant. Gone. There is no longer any I, only we. We are pestilence everlasting, the harbinger of the universal truth of decay. We are the end where all things shall lie. Even you, Blade Bearer.
Lucius moves in a blur, his martial artistry almost too fast for the eye to follow. The lash snaps out, tearing the air as it coils around the scythe, wrenching the champion's guard open. The tip of the radiant sword strikes, lancing through the filth-caked lens of the Death Guard's left eye. It carves through corrupted flesh and rotten bone, before punching out through the back of its helm, fouled and glistening. The blow is perfect, but the Plague Champion is unmoved. Lucius growls, trying to wrench the blade free, but it holds fast as the effluent slathering it calcifies. The lash spasms as greater toxins than its own venom blacken its length. A slow, choking chuckle echoes from the ruined helm.
I see the chains wound about you, shackling your destiny to the whims of the child. He was once your patron, but now he has abandoned you. Like a dying body, you rail against the bacteria within that will consume your flesh. But your efforts wither, slackening, and soon you shall grow cold. The rot shall lay claim to all.
Even for me, you talk too much.
Lucius snarls. He plants his clawed boot in the Death Guard's swollen gut, arching his back and kicking free. The sword tears the champion's head in half as it rips loose in a welter of gushing sickness. A series of lightning-fast slashes carve open its torso. Another takes its arm at the elbow. The lash tears the other from its socket. Gobbets of blighted fat and millipedes covered in coarse black hair slither from the gaping wounds. The laughter never stops.
You are enjoying this. Maybe we have some common ground after all.
We exist beyond pain, beyond pleasure. We have transcended such fleeting things. They exist, but are beneath our care. The transience of flesh yields to the everlasting endurance of the plague, the fortitude of decay.
Lucius leaps forward, an overhead slash splitting the Death Guard from collar to groin. Black blood sprays the deck. Tendons snap as the halves sag and peel apart.
Fortified indeed.
The laughter booms now from the maw of every plague demon ringing Lucius in union with their master. At some unheard call, they scurry to their champion, piling atop its broken form and wriggling into the corpse. Pus and other foulness sheets over them as they congeal into a single massive form. Tree-trunk limbs take shape. Thousands of eyes and snapping lamprey mouths riddle a body the size of a dreadnought. The aggregate demon looms over Lucius. Its steps shake the deck.
You are breathing your last, Blade Bearer. You and your preening followers. The shroud of life is falling. You near the end of the path that leads to the serenity of the grave.
It reaches out with a mitt of writhing demon flesh.
Long has the grandfather watched you. He has yearned to draw you close so you might learn the true nature of eternity. Let us show it to you. Let us carry you across that threshold.
Lucius slashes through the reaching arm. Severed, it crashes to the deck, dissolving into a trio of demons that giggle as they dive back into the mass. The limb reforms in a snap of rotting fat and abused bone.
The grave shall have you, by your will or by ours.
Lucius dives to the side as a clubbing fist smashes a crater into the deck. He makes to lunge forward, but staggers. His fingers rebel, spasming around the hilt of his sword as though the ligaments are strings tugged by some invisible puppeteer. The lapse in concentration nearly costs him his head as the demon's fist hurtles a hand span from his face. With a snarl, Lucius tightens his grip and the spasms recede. He reaches out to the demon at the helm of his ship once more.
Clarion, have we broken free of the storm?
We have, Master. Barely.
Lucius throws himself away from another bludgeoning strike.
Vent the embarkation deck. Now!
As you wish.
The massive shutters at the end of the deck fill the air with the shriek of metal as they peel back to reveal the void beyond. The flickering atmospheric enclosure is all that separates Lucius from the vacuum. The demon staggers, its corpse flesh hide blackening and smouldering as the light of the Gellerfield spills over it. Lucius rolls back over his shoulder, coming up in a crouch. He drives his sword down, sinking half its length into the deck. There is an explosion of silence. The demon flails, thrashing for purchase as decompression hurls it into the void. Lucius's flesh freezes, numbing in the silence as titanic pressure tears at his armor. He holds fast to his sword, anchoring him to the deck as the demon spins beyond the diadem. Chains of flickering gold and scarlet bracket it as the demon dies to the kiss of the warship's guns. The silence within the Eternal's mind is curdled as the caged souls of all his killers assail him as one. They are always there, but now that battle has calmed, they redouble their efforts, begging and cursing. The atmospheric field shimmers back to life, and the shutters clang and rattle as they rumble back into place. Ice crackles from Lucius's armor as he flexes his limbs. The numbness of his existence returns to him, replacing the numbness of the void. Another victory. Another adversary that has failed to land a blow upon Lucius the Eternal. Rising to his feet, he spins the lingering filth from his sword. He raises it to his face, tracing its tip over the network of pale red scars, before settling on a rare strip of unmarred flesh. He doesn't even feel the blade until it scrapes against the bone of his skull. He doesn't feel the flesh part, the warmth of his blood spilling down his face as a new scar is born. He had been able to feel the ritual once, his way of honoring each vanquished foe, but that time is long gone. Lucius stands for a while, alone. He looks down at his hand, seeing the otherworldly forces struggling for control just beneath the flesh.
They are getting worse.
His gaze flicks up to the silent void, in the calm that comes so rarely and so fleetingly within the eye. The deck around him is silent, but for the anguished screams rattling behind his own eyes, the creaking of tormented iron, and the distant laughter of the grave.
The Art of Provocation by Josh Reynolds. Performed by John Banks, Jonathan Keeble, and Toby Longworth. There was a certain sound the wolf claw made. It pierced armor and flesh. A fat, wet crackle, as rune-etched metal talons entered the target, and the matter-disruptive energies took swift effect. It was almost like laughter. Lucas joined in, adding his own chuckle to the wolf claw's pop-sizzle. The orc spasmed, grunting obscenities in its own rude tongue as it tried to throttle him. Greenskins never knew when they were beaten, or so the grey pelts said when they were in their cups.
I've never found that to be the case myself. Just conventional wisdom taken as hard fact. You can know when you're beaten. You just don't like to admit it.
Lucas stared into the orc's glazing eyes.
But then, who does?
What was left of the Xenos crashed to the grating of the central control chamber to join the remains of its fellows. Lucas had left a trail of broken, green bodies stretching back to his entry point into the Vox relay station, after being deposited on the outer hull by Stormfang gunship. The wailing of a structural alarm echoed through the chamber, and he could hear emergency bulkheads grinding into place as the station's autonomous systems acted to seal the breach. The vibrations resonated with the rhythmic pulse of the stasis bomb grafted in place of one of his hearts. He didn't know which. He'd never had occasion to find out. The station sat high in the atmosphere, far above the industrial world of Pollux Tertius, an atmospheric photon tether, tended by a crew of servitors and transmechanics, held it aloft at the center of an invisible web of communication signals. The orcs had a fascination for technology. Their mechs had intended to loot it for their own purposes, hijacking the planetary Voxnet even as Pollux Tertius burned. And Lucas the trickster, Lucas the laughing one, the Bane Wolf, had come to teach those greenskins the error of their ways. There were 2 orcs left. They squinted at him in the flickering haze. The chameleonic, doppelgangeral pelt he wore over his power armor bent the light in odd ways, making his form indistinct and hard to focus on. To the greenskins, there might appear to be 3 of him, or something even more confusing. Lucas chuckled again.
Who's fast?
The orcs eyed him warily. They glanced at one another. Then one gave a roar and barreled towards him, its crude axe raised.
Decisive. I like that.
Lucas slid forwards and caught the haft of the axe, his powered talons piercing the orc's chest. The greenskin slumped, and Lucas swept it aside.
And then there was one.
The last orc thudded towards him, snarling in fury. He couldn't fault the creature's courage.
No lack of bravery, bad and distinct absence of brains.
He didn't rush to meet this one. No point when it was coming to him. He shot it in the head, vaporizing the skull with a liquid hiss. The orc's body kept coming, and Lucas stepped aside to let it stumble past, calling after.
Mind how you go!
It tripped over the remains of the others and tumbled to the deck. Lucas tutted, looking around.
I warned you.
The wall panels were daubed with crude glyphs and bloodstains. The air stank of cooked orc and other worse things. But then the greenskins had held the station for weeks now. It was bound to reek a little. Lucas didn't have much time. His arrival had not gone unnoticed. Between the trail of corpses and the alarm, he wouldn't be hard to find when reinforcements came looking. He was almost looking forward to that. Orcs weren't good for much, but killing them was an excellent way of relieving frustration. He studied the cogitator panels.
Are you still alive, Stryson?
His current, if begrudging, master's voice, growling across the comm frequencies. Lucas smirked.
Did you doubt me, Lord Grimblood?
Always and at length. Have you succeeded?
Kjal Grimblood, the Firewolf, lord and commander of one of the 12 great companies of the Space Wolves chapter. Last cycle, Bran Redmore had been the unlucky recipient of the Jackal Wolf's leash. Lucas's services were passed from company to company on an almost insultingly regular basis. as if he were equal parts burden and responsibility. It was not his fault that the Wolf Lords were more lord than wolf, and inclined to their dignity overmuch, just as it was not his fault that they took his harmless jests so seriously.
Has your famed foresight deserted you, Grimblood? Would we be speaking now if I hadn't succeeded?
Grimblood snarled with impatience, and Lucas grinned. The firewolf burned hot, and it took only the littlest bit of fuel to renew the blaze. A jest here, a bit of bloat-toad venom there. It all added up. His brothers thought him a fool, an annoyance at best, a threat to their sanity at worst. But provocation was an art, and Lucas an artist. Like all artists, he took pride in his work. That they did not understand only proved the validity of it. He counted the seconds, letting Grimblood's impatience build. Then, just as the Wolf Lord was about to speak, he replied.
Yes, Grimblood, I've reached the central control chamber. But I won't be able to hold it, not by myself.
You don't have to. Destroy it and the communications grid with it. I want that planet dark when we arrive, Stuyvesant.
Lucas removed his helmet and set it aside, eager to taste something other than recycled air. His senses stretched. He could smell burnt metal and spoiled meat, and he could hear more than just alarms. Grimblood's pack was loping across the void towards Pollux Tertius, even now. They would arrive in 3 hours, by his estimate. Already, the company's gunships were dueling with Orc vessels in the upper stratosphere to ensure a safe insertion window for the ground assault.
That doesn't seem very entertaining. But that is probably the point, yes?
What was that?
Nothing. It will take some time.
Lucas had been sent ahead of the great company, ostensibly to take the Vox Relay and prevent the Orcs from organizing any sort of unified defense. In reality, his mission was a punishment. The Stormfangs could have easily destroyed the station from a safe distance. But this way, Lucas would remain on the station until someone bothered to retrieve him. Most likely, after all of the glory was won, and the fighting ended. Grimblood certainly knew how to hold a grudge, and a baseless one at that. Dosing the Wolf Lord's Mjod with Grinweed had been a harmless prank, nothing more. But, as his name implied, Grimblood lacked even the barest micron of a sense of humor. Lucas sealed the control chamber. The bulkhead locked into place with a grinding hiss. He gave it a knock and, satisfied, turned back to the Vox systems.
You have a plasma pistol. Use it.
As you say, my lord, but my pistol is still recharging.
He ran his hands over the cogitator panels, tweaking the frequencies rising up from the planet's surface. A squall of feedback caused him to wince. Orc voices snapped into focus, accompanied by a distortion echo. Their voices were like rocks in a steel drum, or hot mud poured over broken glass. Nasty, but distinctive. He was familiar with the Orc tongue, enough to understand their insults and reply in kind. That was all their language was, really. Insults. It was crude and unsubtle, but potent.
1, 2, 3...
He twisted the controls, isolating the voices. There were as many dialects as there were clans. He didn't recognize these, though it made little difference. The root logographic system was the same, whatever the permutation. A fourth signal intruded.
And you make 4. Interesting.
He activated the hololith set above the Vox system and studied it. The flickering image showed that Pollux Tertius was divided into 4 quadrants, and the Orc Warg had splintered accordingly. He listened to the relayed frequencies, scanning back and forth, noting the corresponding areas on the map. The Orcs were using the Vox relay station to bounce their own primitive signals. They would already be spoiling for a fight. They were always spoiling for a fight. Lucas took note of the names that cropped up with something approaching regularity. Those would be the ones in charge. An idea began to take shape, and he chuckled.
I heard that. Stop wasting time and do as I ordered, Stuyvesant.
I fully intend to fulfill my mission objectives.
He began to isolate and modulate certain signals. While his understanding of such technologies was limited, he'd picked up a few tricks from obliging engineers and Lex mechanics in his time. He smiled, remembering one lass and the way she had paled when he bared his fangs at her.
The mission is... Wait. Are you smiling?
No.
You're smiling. I can hear you smiling.
I am merely pleased at the thought of slaughtering Xenos filth.
Grimblood growled.
Are you laughing at me, Jackal Wolf?
I laugh with you, Wolflord, at the thought of the carnage we shall unleash upon these creatures. We shall rip and tear them, and leave not one intact.
You're laughing at me. Those are my words you spit back at me like poison.
Are they? Perhaps. You use so many words, it's impossible not to borrow a few.
You know damn well those were my exact words to you. What are you up to?
Lucas didn't answer. He was opening a general communications channel to broadcast across all frequencies. He cleared his throat. It was best to start small and build on the response. The art of provocation was one of layers.
Bo Snick Tooth says Og Horst Snot Zog Scab.
He racked his brain for the words as he went. It didn't have to be right, just close. Orc language was a thing of approximation more than precision.
What did you call me?
Not you.
Lucas winced as the channel crackled with a blistering response. Queries, mostly. A few insults. Quicker than he'd expected, but that was good. He cycled through the channels and picked another name at random. An isolated frequency this time.
The Scar says Snick Tooth Og Naf Grot Og Naf Boss.
The insults were childish, but those were the best kind. He cycled again. Another general broadcast.
Bonkya Og Gutsgrim Zod.
That one got the best reaction. So he repeated it several times across several isolated frequencies to ensure maximum reach.
Bonkya Og Gutsgrim Zod. Bonkya Og Gutsgrim Zod.
What are you up to? This isn't the time for your usual mischief, Bloodcore.
Lucas's smile bent into a frown as the Wolf Lord emphasized his rank. Grimblood liked to remind Lucas of his lack of advancement. He thought of it as a punishment, and perhaps it was. Lucas, however, had found freedom of a sort. Little was expected of him, and he made the most of it. What more could any true son of Russ ask for than the freedom to run as he wished? But that didn't stop the constant reminders of his status from being irksome.
You sound just like your mother, Wolflord.
What?
Or was it your sister? I get them confused.
It was dangerous to prod in such a fashion, but he couldn't help himself. There was an element of truth in the jibe, however small. He'd shared many beds and had many acquaintances prior to enduring the procedures and rituals of becoming a Space Marine. It was entirely possible that he'd known Grimblood's kin in his past life. Even better, the Wolf Lord knew it.
Repeat yourself. I must have misheard you.
Do you even have a sister? Am I thinking of someone else?
So pleased was Lucas with this game, he almost missed the sound of the not-quite-dead orc rising up behind him. The smell of Xenos blood washed over him, and he turned at the last moment. A wide blade with a jagged edge slashed down, shearing away one of his braids. He snatched up his helmet and smashed the orc across the jaw with it.
Quite a trick. It will be your last.
He thought he'd killed the creature, but orcs were nothing if not durable. The greenskin had recovered its wits after Lucas had felled it, while he had been distracted. Dark blood stained its torso and arms. Its skull was cracked, but it had plenty of fight left in it. It hacked at him, and he was forced to roll aside. He slugged it, rocking it on its heels.
Is that all you've got?
The orc grunted, trying to focus on him.
What was that? What's happening?
The blade came down again, splitting a panel as Lucas stepped aside. Sparks sprayed up to cascade across the floor. Lucas drove the creature back with a sweep of his wolf claw.
You seem to be having a bit of trouble, my green-skinned adversary. Perhaps I should just wait here until you keel over.
The wounded orc reeled, eyes bulging in rage. He wondered if it could understand him. He hoped so. It bellowed again and lunged. Its momentum drove him back against the cogitator bank. He swatted its blade aside, embedding it in the hololith projector, which gave a whine of protest and fizzled into darkness.
Stiveson, report! What are you playing at?
The orc's bloodied head came down against his with a solid thunk. Lucas slumped, dazed. It was like being punched in the skull by an ice bear. Stunned, he couldn't stop it from catching him in a powerful grapple. His lightning claw was pinned to his side, and he couldn't draw his plasma pistol. The orc roared at him, spattering his hair and beard with reeking saliva and blood. He heard the ceramite plates of his armor creak.
Well, what now? Going to yell me to death?
Shackle wolf! Answer me, damn you!
Lucas struggled to free himself, but lacked the leverage. The orc was big and strong. Strong enough to lift a power-armored warrior up off the ground and hold him there.
Stiveson, what's going on? Report!
Nothing, it's all fine. Oh, just give me a moment.
Lucas's head snapped down, meeting the orc's rounded cranium. There was a sound like two stones colliding, and Lucas's world spun. He blinked blood out of his eyes and did it again. Two could play this game. The orc staggered back, gurgling. A third time, and its weakened skull gave way completely with a wet crack. Still, it refused to release him, but its grip had slackened noticeably. Lucas activated the lightning claw and twisted, driving the talons into the orc's side. The greenskin screamed in pain, and suddenly, Lucas was free. He swept the claw out and silenced the Xenos for good.
What's going on? I demand you answer me.
Lucas swayed and shook his head. He kicked the orc.
That's for having such a hard head.
He stumbled back to the comm panel. Despite the blade embedded in it, the Voxcaster was still functioning. He leaned over it, broadcasting across all frequencies.
Look up with the Dragdur og scum. Ordsnoswa!
The Vox crackled with orcish voices, bellowing contradicting orders. He recognized the words for attack and kill among them. The entire relay station shuddered. Proximity alarms sounded. Lucas laughed, but it sounded more like a snarl. As he'd hoped, he'd set something in motion. He tapped at the shattered hololith, trying to get it to work as Grimblood raged on the other end of the link.
What have you done? The Stormfangs are reporting that the Greenskins are turning against one another.
I interrupted enemy communications prior to an assault. Fairly standard.
Frequencies crackled. A channel went dead, abruptly. Then another. He heard the boom of a weapon somewhere close by. Some of the orcs aboard the relay station had obviously heard his last broadcast and taken it to heart. Greenskins were always spoiling for a fight, and he'd given them an excuse. It was happening quicker than he'd expected, but then, that was orcs for you. Always full of surprises. He kicked the body of the orc he'd just killed again, just to make sure.
You've set them at each other's throats! I wanted them blind and deaf, not at war!
Grimblood sounded angry. Good.
Consider it my gift to you.
If they exterminate each other before we arrive, I'm holding you personally responsible, trickster!
All credit for the victory goes to you, my lord.
It's not a victory if they kill each other before I can't do it!
Lucas smiled.
Oh no. Better hurry then.
This is not a worthy deed, Strifeson.
You're the one who can see the future, Grimblood. It's not my fault if your flames of portent didn't warn you of this.
Grimblood roared, causing a signal to crackle with static.
Stop smiling! I can hear you smiling!
Never.
Lucas closed the link. He could almost hear Grimblood's howl of rage, and his smile widened in satisfaction. He looked down at one of the dead orcs.
Not that he'll learn. They never do. I suppose it wouldn't be as much fun if they did.
He stepped back and fired his pistol, melting the cogitators to slag. He heard the thud of hobnailed boots and the bellicose cries of greenskins closing in on the control chamber. He scraped the air with his wolf paw, leaving contrails of hazy energy in its wake. He wondered how many of them he could kill before Grimblood arrived. Enough to feed the fires of the Wolf Lord's wrath, but not so many as to make it blaze out of control. That would come later, when Lucas reminded him of the glories lost and victories snatched from his grasp by his own hand. In a song, perhaps. It would take time to compose it, but he had plenty of that. What with the orcs mostly busy killing each other. Provocation was an art, and all great art took time.
Audible hopes you've enjoyed this program.